Omega found Alpha King drowning beneath the ice, only to see the water rise when she touched him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. Violet had been wandering the dense, icy forest for hours, her boots crunching through the snow with each step. The cold air bit at her cheeks, and the silence was suffocating, save for the occasional howl of wind that echoed through the trees. She had grown accustomed to the wilderness, but something felt off today. As she continued, a sudden sound cut through the stillness, a faint crack, followed by the unmistakable sound of splashing water. Violet's instincts kicked in immediately. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the sound, her heart racing. What she found took her breath away. There, partially submerged in a frozen lake, was the Alpha King, Alexander. His broad shoulders and powerful frame were unmistakable, even in his current state of vulnerability. The man who was once feared by many, revered by all, was now drowning beneath the thick ice. Violet's breath hitched in her throat. She knew who he was. Every Omega knew the stories of Alexander, the Alpha King, the strongest among them all. To see him in this state was unimaginable. He was barely moving, trapped beneath the ice, struggling to breathe as the water rose around him. Without hesitation, Violet knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached out to the ice, feeling its coldness seep through her fingers. She could hear his desperate gasps for air, his movements slow and weak. Violet's mind raced. She knew she couldn't wait for help. The nearest village was miles away, and time was running out for him. Gathering every ounce of strength, she slammed her hands against the ice. The impact reverberated through her, and the water beneath her hands seemed to respond to her touch. For a moment, the air around her crackled with an energy she couldn't quite explain. As if by instinct, her connection to the earth, to the very elements themselves, surged through her. Violet focused, her hands glowing faintly with an otherworldly power. Slowly, the ice began to crack. The sound was deafening, a sharp, violent split. Then, the water began to rise, pushing against the ice, as though it was being controlled by an unseen force. Violet gasped, watching in awe as the water began to recede, taking the ice with it. The Alpha King's body rose to the surface, his chest heaving as he took in desperate breaths of air. He was alive, but barely. Violet quickly pulled him from the icy water, dragging him to the snow-covered shore. His skin was pale, his lips tinged with blue, but there was still life in him. As she knelt beside him, she felt a strange connection forming between them, an invisible thread pulling her to him, despite the danger and the unfamiliarity of the situation. This was no ordinary rescue. Something about this moment felt like destiny, like they were meant to meet here, at this exact moment. Alexander's eyes fluttered open, his gaze landing on her. At first, it was confusion. Then, recognition. Violet could see it in his eyes. He knew who she was, and she could feel the weight of his gaze. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that neither of them could deny. Violet swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. She had saved his life, but this was only the beginning of a much larger story that neither of them was prepared for. Violet's heart raced as she watched Alexander's chest rise and fall, the steady rhythm of his breathing a welcome sign of life. The icy water had numbed her hands, but the warmth of his skin against her fingers was a stark contrast. His body was cold to the touch, and his once confident, powerful frame now appeared fragile. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The Alpha King, the strongest of them all, had been at death's door, and she had pulled him from it. She glanced around, her mind racing. The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, but the sound of the wind was deafening. No one else was here, just the two of them. Violet's breath came out in quick puffs as she shifted, adjusting her position to ensure Alexander wasn't lying directly on the cold ground. She needed to warm him, keep him safe until he regained enough strength. He stirred beneath her touch, groaning as his eyes fluttered open. The moment their gazes met, something shifted between them. His eyes, usually so calculating, now looked vulnerable, searching. For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. But then his expression hardened, and he tried to push himself up, wincing in pain. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it was laced with a commanding authority that only an alpha could possess. Violet swallowed, unsure how to respond. I found you," she said simply. Her voice trembled, but she couldn't hide the truth. "I didn't think you'd make it." Alexander stared at her, confusion flashing across his face as he tried to comprehend the situation. "You're an Omega," he said, his tone more question than statement. Violet nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, but I'm not like other Omegas," she said softly. "I have a gift." She didn't elaborate. She wasn't sure she could trust him with the details, not yet. Alexander continued to look at her, his gaze unreadable. His pride, his strength, everything he had ever known, was in question now. He had been saved by an Omega, someone many in his world saw as weak, as nothing more than a companion. It didn't make sense. His brow furrowed, but his body was still too weak to fight off the shivers that racked him. "I don't understand," he muttered, his words more to himself than to her. Violet didn't speak at first. She simply sat there, watching him, knowing that there was so much more between them than this moment alone. He had been saved by her, but what would happen after this? What would happen when he regained his strength? She couldn't imagine how he would react. The Alpha King, proud and fierce, in debt to an Omega. But Violet had no time to waste on what-ifs. She needed to get him back to safety, to find shelter. The storm was growing stronger, and the last thing either of them needed was to face the elements in their current state. Violet helped Alexander sit up, his muscles trembling beneath her touch. "We need to move," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt. "The storm is getting worse." Alexander didn't argue. His body was too weak to resist. As he stood with her help, his legs buckled, and he collapsed against her. For a moment, Violet hesitated, unsure how to hold him up, but she quickly adjusted, supporting his weight as they began to move through the snow-covered ground. Every step they took was a challenge, but they had no choice but to keep going. There was nowhere to hide, no one else to help. Just the two of them, together in a world that seemed to have no mercy. Violet's heart was heavy with the realization that whatever came next, things between them would never be the same. Violet guided Alexander through the storm, her breath visible in the icy air, the snow swirling around them like 1,000 tiny daggers. His body leaned heavily against hers, and every step he took seemed to drain him more. Violet could feel the cold seeping through her own layers of clothing, but she focused on him, on his well-being. She had no idea where they were going, but she knew they couldn't stop. The wilderness stretched out in every direction, unforgiving and vast. If they didn't find shelter soon, the storm would claim them both. She glanced down at Alexander, his face pale, his eyes barely open, as if the weight of his exhaustion was too much for him to bear. She had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so human. "Hold on, just a little longer," she whispered, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Alexander's head lolled slightly, but he still managed to mumble something. His words were slurred, unintelligible, but Violet could sense the frustration in his tone. It wasn't just the cold that was wearing him down, it was his pride. He had always been the one in control, the Alpha King, the one others turned to for strength. Now, he was depending on her, and that fact seemed to gnaw at him. Violet wanted to say something to comfort him, but the words felt useless in the face of what they were going through. There was no time for reassurance. She needed to focus. They stumbled across a small cave, barely visible against the dark sky, hidden among the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The wind howled as they stumbled inside, and Violet quickly helped Alexander sit against the wall, her hands shaking as she pulled off his wet clothing and wrapped him in a blanket she'd kept in her pack. She couldn't help but notice how different he looked without the regal armor, the fierce demeanor he was known for. Without it all, he was just a man, wounded, tired, and in need of help. Violet sat beside him, her own body shivering from the cold, but she didn't care. He needed warmth. She knew that the storm outside would pass, but their survival in the wilderness was far from guaranteed. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, not really expecting an answer. Alexander's eyes fluttered open again, and this time, they met hers. There was a flicker of recognition in them, a spark of the strong alpha king she knew. But it was fleeting, replaced quickly by the exhaustion that seemed to consume him. "I'll survive," he muttered, his voice weak but determined. Violet nodded. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about what would happen next. She wasn't sure how they would make it through the storm or what the future held, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something between them had changed. The way he looked at her, the way he depended on her, it wasn't just because she had saved his life. There was something deeper there, something unspoken, and it terrified her. "We'll rest here for now," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll keep watch." Alexander didn't argue. He leaned back against the wall, his eyes closing once more. The cave was small, but it offered shelter. Violet kept her watch, her thoughts drifting between the storm outside and the mysterious connection that had begun to grow between her and the Alpha King. She couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it. All she knew was that things had changed, and somehow, they were no longer just two strangers in the wilderness. Something else had begun to form between them, something that neither of them had anticipated. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave, for the first time since they had met, there was a moment of quiet. A fleeting peace that seemed to promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. Violet sat by the small fire she had managed to build, the crackling flames offering the only light in the dark cave. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling through the trees, but within the cave, it was strangely peaceful. She kept her eyes on Alexander, who was resting, his face still pale, but no longer showing the frantic exhaustion he had earlier. His breath was more even now, and the warmth from the fire seemed to be doing its job, but Violet couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. She knew they couldn't stay here forever. The cave offered temporary shelter, but the storm wouldn't last forever, and once it cleared, they would have to face the reality of what happened next. What would happen once Alexander was back to full strength? Would he remember this moment? Would he see her as just the Omega who saved his life, or something more? She glanced over at him again. His eyes were closed, his body still, but there was something in his posture that made her wonder if he was pretending to sleep, if he was only waiting for the right moment to speak. She cleared her throat softly and looked away, staring into the fire. She wasn't sure what she expected. Some part of her had known that this situation would change things. She could feel the shift in the air between them, the strange connection that had formed when she pulled him from the water, the way their gazes locked, the way his exhaustion had revealed something deeper. Violet didn't know if she was ready for any of it. Alexander's voice broke the silence, low and raspy. "You should rest," he said, though there was an edge to his words, a command buried beneath his tone. Violet hesitated, then turned to face him. He was looking at her now, his gaze steady. Despite his weakened state, there was still a sharpness in his eyes. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed a trace of uncertainty. She wasn't sure what he expected from her, what he wanted her to say. She had saved his life, yes, but that didn't mean she was prepared for whatever this connection between them meant. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It's dangerous." Violet didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She knew the risks. She had always known them. But there was something in his words, in the way he spoke to her now, that made her feel seen, in a way she hadn't expected. "I didn't come here to babysit you," she finally said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "I came here because you needed help." There was a long pause. Alexander didn't respond right away, and for a moment, Violet wondered if she had crossed a line. But when he spoke again, his voice was calm, measured. "I don't know why you're helping me," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I owe you more than just my life." Violet didn't know how to respond. She couldn't understand why she had done what she did. It was instinct, yes, but it was also something more, something deeper. Alexander shifted, trying to sit up straighter, though his movements were slow. "You may not understand," he continued, "but I do." He paused, his gaze flicking down to her hands, which were still trembling from the cold. "You've saved me, Violet. You've given me a chance I didn't deserve, and I can't ignore that." Violet's heart skipped a beat at his words. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't prepared for the vulnerability in his voice. For the first time since they had met, he didn't sound like the Alpha King, the leader everyone feared. He sounded like a man, tired, broken, and in need of help. I don't need anything from you, she said, her voice softer now, more uncertain. I just did what was right. Alexander's expression softened, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was gratitude, yes, but also something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite place. Then maybe it's time I do what's right too, he said, his words barely above a whisper. Violet couldn't explain why, but she felt the weight of his words. She couldn't explain why the air between them felt heavier, more significant, but she knew it had changed. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that whatever happened, they might face it together. Violet woke to the soft sound of rain against the cave's entrance. The storm had passed, but the weather was still unpredictable. The air was heavy with humidity, the thick mist of the forest creeping in from the outside. She sat up slowly, stretching her stiff limbs, trying to shake off the lingering cold that had settled in her bones. Alexander was still asleep beside her, his breathing deep and steady. She couldn't help but watch him for a moment, taking in the way his powerful frame was now at rest, no longer tense or rigid. He looked almost peaceful, a far cry from the strong, intimidating alpha king she had first encountered. Violet didn't know what to make of everything that had happened. She had saved him from the ice, but in doing so, she had unknowingly stepped into something much larger than she had ever imagined. There was a part of her that couldn't stop thinking about his words from the night before. He owed her more than just his life. She wondered what that really meant. Did he feel indebted to her? Or was there something more to the way he spoke, something she couldn't quite understand? She didn't want to overthink it. The last thing she needed was to complicate things further. But it wasn't easy to ignore the tension that hung between them. The storm had brought them together, but it was the uncertainty of what came next that weighed heavily on her mind. She couldn't forget that he was the Alpha King, a man with power, influence, and responsibilities she couldn't even begin to understand. And she was just an Omega. She had no place in his world. Yet, something had shifted. She couldn't deny the connection between them, the pull she felt every time their eyes met. Violet shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She needed to focus on the present. The storm had passed, but they were still stranded in the wilderness. They needed to get back to civilization, if there was even any civilization left after the storm. She packed her things quietly, trying not to disturb Alexander. Her fingers brushed the cold, damp ground as she arranged her pack, but the sound of movement from behind her made her freeze. Leaving already? Alexander's voice was low and hoarse, still heavy with sleep. Violet turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his gaze. He was sitting up now, the blanket falling away from his broad shoulders as he looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, but it was different from the tension of before. There was no anger, no prideful distance. Just something else. I thought it would be best to leave. Before the weather gets worse, Violet said, trying to keep her voice steady. Alexander's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't let you go alone. Violet frowned, caught off guard by his words. I'm not alone, she replied, though the truth was, she had never felt more alone than she did in that moment. I can manage. Alexander's gaze never left her. He seemed to be studying her, as if trying to understand something he couldn't quite put into words. You saved me, he said quietly. I can't just let you leave like this. Violet opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, Alexander stood, his movements slow but purposeful. He walked toward her, and the air between them seemed to crackle with energy. She felt a shift, a tension in the space that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Alexander stopped a few feet away from her, his presence looming, commanding. You don't owe me anything, Violet said firmly, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. I did what anyone would have done. Alexander's gaze softened again, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe, he said quietly, but I still owe you more than that. Violet swallowed hard, the words echoing in her mind. You don't owe me anything, she repeated, though this time, her voice was softer, less certain. Alexander didn't say anything more. He simply stood there, looking at her, as if waiting for something. Violet wasn't sure what that something was, but as she looked into his eyes, she couldn't deny that something had changed. Something between them that neither of them could ignore anymore. And despite everything, Despite the confusion and uncertainty, she felt a part of her, something deep inside her, wanting to stay, to see where this strange, unspoken bond would lead them. Violet and Alexander had traveled for hours, the terrain increasingly difficult as they moved deeper into the forest. The once heavy clouds had begun to break apart, allowing the faint light of the setting sun to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Despite the beauty of the moment, the silence between them was anything but peaceful. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. They had both retreated into their own thoughts, each processing the events that had unfolded over the past few days. The more they walked, the more Violet felt the weight of the bond between them growing heavier, and it was something she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the fact that she had saved his life, though that alone should have been enough to tie them together. It was the unspoken understanding that had formed between them. Alexander, the mighty Alpha King, now walking beside her as an equal, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. She glanced over at him as they continued forward. He was still recovering, his movements slower than usual, though he had insisted on walking despite the lingering exhaustion. The rain had finally stopped, but the ground beneath their feet was soft and slippery from the storm. Violet had offered to carry him again, but he refused, insisting that he could manage. "How much farther?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was a little stronger than before, though there was still an underlying weariness to it. Violet looked around, trying to get her bearings. "Not much," she replied. "We should reach the edge of the forest soon. After that, it's just a few more miles to the village." Alexander nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. "I'm not used to relying on anyone," he admitted after a long pause. Violet's steps faltered for a moment. She wasn't sure how to respond. The Alpha King, the most powerful of all, admitting weakness. It was something she never thought she would witness. "You don't have to rely on me," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "I just want to help. That's all." Alexander's gaze flicked toward her, and for a moment, Violet felt the weight of his eyes on her. It was hard to tell what he was thinking. His expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something in the way he looked at her that made her heart beat a little faster. "You've already done more than I could ever ask," he said quietly. There was a sincerity in his words that caught her off guard. She didn't know how to respond. It wasn't just gratitude she heard in his voice. It was something deeper, something that made her wonder if there was more to their connection than either of them were ready to admit. The quiet between them stretched on for a while before Violet spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to thank me. You were never meant to be alone." Alexander stopped walking for a moment, his gaze searching hers. There was a hint of something, perhaps regret, perhaps something more, but it was gone before she could fully place it. He shook his head, then continued walking. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "To be the one everyone depends on. To always be the one who has to hold everything together." Violet stayed silent, not wanting to interrupt. She understood more than he realized. She had never been in his position, but she knew what it was like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. She had seen it in the eyes of others, in the way they carried themselves when they thought no one was looking. "I'm not sure I can keep this up much longer," Alexander continued, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Being the alpha everyone expects me to be." Violet's heart ached for him. It was clear now that beneath the tough exterior, he was struggling. And it wasn't just his physical body that was broken, it was his spirit, too. She reached out instinctively, her hand brushing his arm in a quiet gesture of comfort. He flinched at the touch, but only for a second. The tension between them was palpable, and yet, it felt oddly right. For the first time since they had met, Violet didn't feel like an outsider, an Omega who didn't belong. She felt as though, in this moment, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Alexander looked at her, his expression softening. "You've shown me more kindness than anyone else ever has," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I don't know how to repay you for that." Violet's heart skipped a beat, but she held his gaze, not knowing how to respond. The air between them felt charged, and despite the lingering uncertainty, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. Violet and Alexander had been walking for what felt like hours, the landscape shifting from dense forest to open fields. The sun was low now, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. The day had passed in a quiet blur, with only the sound of their footsteps breaking the silence between them. Alexander seemed to be recovering, though the weariness still clung to him. Violet glanced over at him, noticing how he kept his gaze focused ahead, as if avoiding the emotions that swirled between them. She understood. Neither of them was ready to confront whatever it was that had started to grow between them. It wasn't just the bond forged through the storm, though that had been the catalyst. It was something else. A tension, unspoken yet undeniable. Violet had never expected to feel this way. She had always been independent, self-sufficient. She was an Omega, and she had always known her place in the world. But this was different. There was something about Alexander. Something about his vulnerability, his strength, his quiet moments of honesty, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had always believed. "We're close," Violet said after a while, her voice breaking the silence. Alexander didn't respond immediately, but she could see the way his jaw tightened, the way his posture stiffened. She knew he was still struggling with something, though she wasn't sure what. He had always been the Alpha King, the one everyone depended on. To see him like this, walking beside her as an equal, was a far cry from the man she had once imagined him to be. "How did you survive out here?" he asked, finally breaking his silence. Violet hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "I've always known how to take care of myself," she said simply. "This isn't my first time in the wild." She glanced at him, catching his gaze for a brief moment. "What about you?" she asked. "How did you end up in that lake?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant, as if he were searching for the right words. "I wasn't prepared," he said, his voice quiet, almost regretful. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I was invincible." Violet frowned, but she didn't say anything. She understood more than he realized. "None of us are invincible," she said softly. "Not even you." Alexander glanced at her, a flicker of something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps recognition, passing across his features. "I suppose you're right," he said, his voice low but steady. The tension between them had shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just about the storm or the journey ahead. It was about something deeper, something neither of them could ignore. Violet felt it, the unspoken connection that had grown stronger between them. It was strange, and it was frightening, but it was there. They had both survived something together. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable. And somehow, that had forged a bond between them. They walked in silence for a few more moments before Violet spoke again. "We'll make it to the village by nightfall," she said, more to herself than to him. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." Alexander nodded, but there was something in his expression, something in the way he looked at her, that made Violet's heart skip a beat. "You've already taken care of me," he said quietly, his words holding a weight that felt different from anything he had said before. Violet's pulse quickened, and for a moment, she wasn't sure what to say. The words he had spoken, so simple yet so full of meaning, hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. She had never expected this, never expected to feel the way she did now, walking beside him, their fates intertwined in a way neither of them could deny. As they continued on, the village slowly coming into view on the horizon, Violet realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would be the same. They had both changed in ways they didn't fully understand yet. But one thing was clear, they had started something, a journey together, that neither of them could turn back from. Violet and Alexander approached the edge of the forest as the light of day began to fade. The village was in sight now, its humble buildings peeking through the trees, but neither of them rushed toward it. The distance between them and the village felt like a boundary, a place where everything would change. Violet could feel it in her bones, the end of one journey, and the beginning of another, one that neither of them was prepared for. As they walked, the silence between them felt more comfortable now, no longer heavy with the weight of uncertainty, but rather filled with a quiet understanding. They had both been through something together, something that neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just the storm or the physical hardships. It was the way they had shared moments of vulnerability, the way they had depended on each other when neither one of them was supposed to need anyone else. And now, here they were, two people who had been thrown together by fate, walking side by side, unsure of what to expect next. We'll reach the village soon, Violet said, her voice breaking the silence. Alexander's gaze shifted toward her, a flicker of something, perhaps appreciation, perhaps something deeper, in his eyes. I know, he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. I just didn't expect to end up here, like this. Violet raised an eyebrow, glancing at him. You didn't expect to be saved? She asked, a hint of amusement in her tone. Alexander's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by something more serious. No, he said, his voice low. I didn't expect to need anyone. Not like this. Violet's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had known, of course, that Alexander was not someone who was used to asking for help. He was an alpha, a leader, a man of strength and authority. But hearing him admit to needing someone, admitting that he had relied on her, was different. It was raw and vulnerable in a way she had never imagined. You don't need to thank me, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I did what anyone would have done. Alexander shook his head, the faintest of chuckles escaping his lips. Not everyone would have done what you did, he said. Not everyone would have risked everything for someone they barely know. Violet didn't know how to respond to that. She had saved him because it felt like the right thing to do, not because she had expected anything in return. But there was something in his words, something that made her wonder if he saw her differently now. It wasn't a risk, she said, more to herself than to him. It was just the right thing to do. Alexander didn't speak again for a while, and Violet didn't press him. She could tell that he was processing his own thoughts, his own feelings. There was a lot going on behind his eyes, but she wasn't sure what it was. He had been the Alpha King, the one everyone feared and respected, and now here he was, walking beside her, sharing the same struggles, the same journey. It was a humbling thing to witness. When they finally reached the village, it was quiet, the streets empty as most of the villagers had retreated indoors, likely to escape the remnants of the storm. Violet led Alexander toward a small, welcoming inn at the center of the village. The warmth of the building, the soft glow of lantern light inside, was a welcome contrast to the chill they had both endured. As they entered, the innkeeper looked up, surprise in her eyes at the sight of the two travelers. You look like you've been through quite a bit, she said, eyeing them both with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Violet smiled softly, grateful for the warmth of the building and the gentle tone of the innkeeper. We've had a rough journey, she said. We're just looking for a place to rest for the night. The innkeeper nodded, gesturing for them to sit. You're welcome here, she said kindly. Violet and Alexander sat at a table near the fire, the warmth enveloping them as they finally relaxed for the first time in days. It was quiet in the inn, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything they had gone through, the storm, the journey, the unspoken understanding that had formed between them, settled in the space between them. Violet glanced at Alexander again, his face softening in the firelight, the lines of exhaustion still visible but not as overwhelming as they had been. He looked different now, more human somehow, more real, and Violet couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would they return to their separate lives, or had something changed between them that could never be undone? The answer to that question, Violet knew, wasn't something either of them could predict. But as she sat there, in the quiet warmth of the inn, with Alexander by her side, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, they had already crossed a threshold, and nothing would ever be the same. Violet sat in the quiet warmth of the inn, the soft crackle of the fire filling the room with a comforting sound. The tension from the journey had finally begun to ebb away, but there was still an undercurrent of something between her and Alexander. She could feel it every time their eyes met, the unspoken connection that had grown between them. Despite the comfort of the room, despite the safety of the village, Violet couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. The storm had passed, but the storm within her still lingered. Alexander, sitting across from her, had been silent for a while. He was staring into the fire, his expression thoughtful, almost distant. Violet wasn't sure what he was thinking, but she had a sense that he was lost in his own thoughts, wrestling with something that he wasn't ready to share. She couldn't blame him. She had her own battles to fight. You know, Violet began, breaking the silence. I never thought I'd find myself in this position. I never thought I'd be here, with you, like this. Alexander looked up at her, his eyes catching hers for a moment before he spoke. I never thought I'd need help either, he said softly. I always thought I could handle everything on my own. His voice carried a weight that matched the exhaustion in his face. Violet could see it now, the burden of leadership, the weight of expectation that he had carried for so long. The Alpha King, the one who had always been in control, now seemed so vulnerable. No one can handle everything on their own, she said gently. We all need someone, even if we don't admit it. Alexander's gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, the rigid walls he had built around himself seemed to crack. I never asked for this, he said, almost to himself. Being the Alpha, carrying the responsibility of so many. I didn't choose this life. Violet didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. She understood more than he realized. The pressure of being responsible for others, the loneliness that came with it. It was something she had seen in people before, something she had experienced in her own way. I know, she said quietly. But you're not alone anymore. Not with me. Alexander looked at her then, his eyes searching hers, and Violet felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just the fire. It was something deeper, something between them that had been building ever since that moment on the ice. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then hesitated, closing it again. Violet didn't push him. She could see that he was struggling with something, and she wasn't sure if he was ready to share it. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but full of meaning. You saved my life, Alexander said after a moment, his voice soft but firm. And I don't know how to repay you for that. Violet shook her head, not wanting him to misunderstand her. You don't owe me anything, she said, her voice steady. I did what I had to do, what anyone would have done. Alexander's eyes lingered on her, a mixture of gratitude and something else flickering there, something that felt like the beginning of something new. Maybe, he said quietly, but I can't help but feel like there's more to this. More than just a debt. Violet didn't know what to say to that. She had felt it too, the growing bond between them, the connection that had formed in the midst of their shared struggles. She had saved him, yes, but something had shifted. They had been through too much together for things to go back to how they were. The door to the inn creaked open then, and the innkeeper appeared with 2 mugs of warm tea. She set them down on the table and gave them both a knowing smile before retreating. Violet took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through her, but her mind was still on Alexander. She glanced at him, and he was watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. I don't know what comes next, he said softly, breaking the silence once again. But I do know that I can't face it alone. Violet's heart skipped a beat. The vulnerability in his words was unlike anything she had ever heard from him before. It was the first time she truly believed that he saw her not just as an Omega, but as someone he could rely on, someone he could trust. She reached out, her hand brushing his across the table. The contact was simple, yet it spoke volumes. You're not alone, she said, her voice steady, even as her heart raced. Not anymore. The weight of their shared journey, their unspoken bond, hung in the air between them. Violet didn't know what the future held, but as she looked into Alexander's eyes, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.